The recognition arrives without ceremony. It does not require a dramatic confrontation or a final piece of external evidence. It settles in the body first, a tightness that has been present for longer than the conscious mind has been willing to name. You have looked across a table or a screen and registered the flicker of something incongruent. The words continued to land in the expected places. The tone remained soft. The face held its practiced openness. Yet something underneath the performance refused to align. That discrepancy was never paranoia. It was data arriving ahead of the story you preferred to keep intact. You are not unobservant. You are not deficient in judgment. You have simply operated for a long interval under a governing priority that placed compassion above pattern recognition. Benefit of the doubt was extended past the point of sustainability. Each new inconsistency was absorbed and reinterpreted as stress, as overwhelm, as temporary confusion. The knife continued its incremental work, while the explanations remained plausible enough to postpone the fuller accounting. The person across from you registered the quiet shifts in your attention. They felt the moments when your gaze lingered a fraction too long, when your replies shortened, when the automatic warmth cooled by degrees. The awareness that they stood in front of someone capable of eventually assembling the complete picture produced its own form of urgency. Avoidance became strategy. Deception of this density is rarely a single fabrication. It is stratified. Surface statements rest on secondary omissions, which rest on tertiary arrangements that were never disclosed. The architecture is maintained through timing, through selective presence, through the careful management of what you are allowed to see and when. Distance is framed as busyness. Silence is framed as the need for space. New entanglements are framed as coincidence or timing. The common thread is the refusal to stand inside a single coherent account long enough for it to be examined. When the weight of accumulated contradiction becomes difficult to carry, the preferred solution is rarely confession. It is disappearance. Blocking, ghosting, rapid replacement, or the sudden claim of overwhelm all serve the same function. Exit before accountability can consolidate. This pattern often has history. Many who rely on layered untruth have spent years inside relationships that absorbed the cost for them. Someone was always available to accept the revised narrative, to smooth the social consequences, to treat the latest rupture as an isolated event rather than a sequence. You declined that role. You became the first sustained presence that declined to mother the guilt or to provide continuous laundering of the conscience. That refusal is experienced as threat. A person who can see the construction of the mask without being fully taken in by it removes the usual margins for error. Panic follows. The performance itself is practiced. The face remains composed. The voice stays light. Innocence is offered as the default setting. Behind the presentation sits a cold and efficient priority, preservation of the false structure at nearly any relational cost. Bridges are burned without apparent hesitation once they threaten to provide a clear line of sight. Silence is deployed. Contact is severed. Replacement is accelerated. From the outside, the sequence can look like rejection or upgrade. From closer range, it reads as flight from exposure. You were not discarded because something superior appeared. You were exited because your continued presence made sustained pretense increasingly expensive. You functioned as an unintended mirror. In ordinary light, the reflection was flattering enough to tolerate. Under the sharper light of your growing clarity, the reflection became intolerable. Avoidance, then, is not primarily about you. It is about the discomfort of being seen with the scaffolding visible. You were the element that could not be fully absorbed into the false account. The lie required your continued confusion in order to remain viable. Once confusion began to lift, the structure lost her integrity. The clearer seeing does not arrive all at once. It spreads. Smiles that once felt uncomplicated begin to carry residual calculation. Apologies begin to sound pre-loaded with the next maneuver. Memories that had been stored as evidence of connection begin to reorganize around the gaps and the pauses and the careful management of your reactions. What had been interpreted as remorse reveals itself in retrospect as strategy. Liars of this order rarely offer unprompted confession. They offer calibrated responses designed to limit damage and preserve optionality. You were the variable that resisted full calibration. When control of the narrative became uncertain, the relationship itself was sacrificed. A darker layer exists beneath the direct deceptions. Doubt about your own perception was allowed to take root and was left undisturbed. You were permitted to spiral while the other party remained composed. Sleep was lost on your side of the ledger. The weight of unanswered questions was carried as if it were personal failure. Tears were witnessed without disruption of the performance. The tremor in the voice was noted and set aside. Self-blame was allowed to flourish because it delayed the moment when the external accounting would become unavoidable. Throughout that interval, you continued to appear, to extend understanding, to hold space, to offer a depth of regard that was never matched. Loyalty of that intensity was received and then used as cover. The assumption was that your goodwill had no practical upper limit, and that discovery, if it came, could still be managed. Pain of this order does not produce uniform results. Some people collapse under it. Others are refined by it. The second outcome is less discussed, because it is less convenient for those who preferred the earlier arrangement. The version of you that once chased explanations, that once required a coherent closing conversation, that once measured personal stability by the presence of the other party's attention, has been retired. In its place stands a quieter and less available configuration. Ghosting no longer triggers the old pursuit sequence. Silence from the other side is met with a private recognition rather than a public campaign for clarity. The truth has a habit of surfacing without assistance. Cowards are often revealed by their exits more clearly than by their statements. There is a specific liberation that follows the decision to stop negotiating with an illusion. The grief is real. It is also clarifying. What is mourned is less the person than the story that had been constructed around them. The affection that was offered in good faith, it is recognized as having been directed at a carefully edited surface. Once that recognition stabilizes, the emotional economy changes. The habit of interrogating their silence is replaced by a growing preference for one's own. The reflex to interpret distance as a problem to be solved is replaced by the decision to treat distance as information. The internal debate about whether one was too demanding or too intense is replaced by a colder assessment of who benefited from the previous imbalance. You have been slower to claim the implications of survival. Survival here is not merely the continuation of breath and schedule. It is the retention of the capacity to generate peace, without requiring the other party's participation or confession. That peace is not gifted. It is assembled in the aftermath of chaos, in the deliberate refusal to keep irrigating connections that have already declared themselves finished. It does not require exposure campaigns or public verdicts. Absence itself becomes the clearest statement available. The silence that once felt like abandonment becomes in your possession a completed boundary. It is audible to the person who still expects residual access. It registers in the hesitation before a message is sent, in the suppressed impulse to reach out, in the private inventory of what is no longer available. The moment of irreversible loss for them is not the original deception, nor the act of disappearance, nor the rapid involvement of a replacement. It is the quieter internal event in which you looked at the pattern and declined to continue negotiating with it. From that point forward, the old levers lose purchase. The need to be heard by them diminishes. The need to be understood by them diminishes. The need for a closing narrative that places every event in satisfying order diminishes. You become the source of the only closure that is actually required. The questions that once formed themselves against a pillow at night receive their answers from the accumulated evidence rather than from any external admission. The healing that was assumed to be impossible without their participation turns out to be possible precisely because their participation is no longer required. The most destabilizing outcome for someone whose influence depended on your continued distress is your visible reconstruction without them. The expected sequence was collapse, pursuit, bitterness, or imitation of their methods. The observed sequence is progressive unreachability. The silence that follows is not punitive theater. The decisive discovery is simple and non-negotiable. You were never the secondary prize in the exchange. You were the standard. They were the examination. They remain free to observe the outcome from whatever distance the new boundaries enforce. The coldness they perceive is simply the absence of the earlier over-availability. They will not be supplied with the detailed curriculum of what changed. If they possessed the full sequence, the self-accounting would be theirs to endure. It is no longer yours to manage.